It's Neon Liberalism, the podcast, episode number 2. I'm Jason Brigham. With me again, Samantha Hancox-Lee. I almost said as always, but this is only our second episode ever. It will be always, every week. And today, our first guest. Didn't have a guest last time. We do this time. Sophia Hottel authored an article this week at Liberal Currents. Liberal Currents publishes our fine podcast. The article Sophia published with us this week, Abandoning Trans Rights is Not a Path to Victory. And in the first paragraph of the article, Sophia admits she's the reason the Republicans won both the presidency and Congress. Excited to have you here, Sophia. Explain, why did you cause this?
How could you do it? That's what I really want to know here.
I've been
How has
traumatized.
one person have so much power?
I existed too much. You see, like I was too visible. I stepped outside and that was the end of it. It was just over from there. Yeah, there's this emerging theme emerged over the last week. Yeah, week and change since the election that trans people are the reason that we lost. Embracing trans rights is the reason that Democrats lost the election. They were just too pro-gender ideology and pronouns. So again, really like to apologize. It's all my fault. I'll just, not be here as much anymore. And then Democrats will win and everything will be good with the world.
I mean, that's certainly the narrative that I seem to be getting from some what you might call mainstream pundits. Do you have my suspicions, though, about it? Because these people never seem to like trans people in the first place.
No, none of them that really seem to be pushing it were really that strong on it in the first place. Now, there are a few exceptions. Seth Moulton, representative from Massachusetts, he was the first elected to come out and be like, Democrats, they're not willing to face the real issues that, Americans are having, like trans athletes. He actually said that. I laugh every time I think about it because I don't know how many people are out there seeing and is competing against trans athletes, but he had previously been involved in pro-LGBT rights stuff, and yet he took a heel turn. So that kind of made some people mad.
Yeah, what you talk about here is interesting in terms of like, are we a real problem? Just to sort of put my cards on the table here, this is the thing that I always find kind of fascinating about the trans issue is that there just aren't very many of us. We are 1 plus maybe -% of the population, not a very small fraction of the population. As far as trans athletes go, I don't think you could field an entire soccer team out of trans soccer players in our state, who are, competing in, at a state level. Like, I don't think you could do it. And yet, apparently, trans athletes are one of the major crises confronting our nation. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit about that, actually, Sophia. Like, if we are materially, numerically not very important, why have we become such a central culture war issue in these times?
Well, part of it is definitely that Republicans just wanted a strong wedge. That's what they were doing this election. They wanted something where they could just shave off a couple of voters from the Democrats, where they can point out, the Democrats' most extreme and radical positions from the median voter's perspective. And then a few people who were kind of on the edge might turn towards Republicans. It is cynical. It is politics. Unfortunately, we're seeing that same kind of dynamic happening right now with Sarah McBride entering Congress. She had just been elected as the first transgender person elected to Congress. And Representative Nancy Mace, Republican, is making a very big deal out of her using women's restrooms. Now, what's interesting about that is that Nancy Mace used to be one of the more pro-LGBT Republicans. She's on the record saying, I don't think anybody should be discriminated against when talking about LGBT people. So this is quite the heel turn that we're seeing. And it is definitely in part just politics. They want more votes. They want to try to...
I want to press you a little bit on the idea that this is cynical.
Mhm.
I mean, certainly for people like Mace, it clearly seems to be cynical. Moulton thinks he's being cynical, and there's kind of a lineage here where Republicans used to campaign on banning gay marriage. George W. Bush campaigned on banning gay marriage. You know, the gays are coming for your children used to be one of their rallying cries. You know, gay acceptance has come, I mean, frankly, come a long way since when I was a child. And so they've kind of moved on from, you know, that aspect of the LGBT coalition to a new target, namely trans people. And so, like you say, you can kind of see it as a wedge, like you say, to peel off voters from the Democratic coalition. Is that true, though? I mean, does it work? Does transphobia running on trans issues translate into political success?
I would say no. I don't think there's any evidence that that's the case. Like I believe you brought up it's like Jason brought up in the first episode that in the swing states where, Trump and Harris were really campaigning, where, as you and I both know very well, they were just flooding us with these ads about trans athletes and such. Harris did better than in the rest of the country. It was in the areas where they didn't campaign at all that Trump made the biggest gains over 2020.
Yeah, it's like people seem to have it through their heads like, yeah, where Harris campaigned hardest, she did well. And they don't seem to have it through their heads where Trump campaigned hardest, he did badly.
Yeah.
They're the
Yeah.
same thing. Trump's ad campaign targeted the swing states where he did poorly. He did worse than he did nationally, right? Relative to the
Yeah.
last time out, which is all that would matter, right? So if you're
Yeah.
assessing the campaign and you're saying Trump's number one advertising issue was transphobia, and he aimed all his ads at states, and those states said, no thanks, basically. He won the states, but, it's in spite of the relative failure of his campaign.
Yeah.
So I don't quite get. It's an amazing mental trick that I think some people are just not managing to grasp this point.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, Trump is hardly the first Republican to campaign hard on trans issues. A variety of Republican electeds have tried to make it a wedge issue, like you said, in years past, and none of them have done particularly well. A number of them have lost election. There was the whole bathroom bill panic in North Carolina a few years ago. That did not go over well for Republicans. So I think the idea that this is cynically done isn't quite correct. Again, for certain people, it might be cynical. They just think the tide is going one way. They want to go with the tide. Maybe Nancy Mace is like that. Seth Moulton is like that. We can argue about what's in their souls. But I think in general, there's got to be some more ideologically motivated reason why Republicans are turning so hard to transphobia. Do you want to speculate on that?
Yes, I would say it's definitely part of the wider worldwide turn against gender. And I literally just say gender because that's how a lot of these figures will say they're against gender. That's their problem. That might sound a little silly to you and me, and maybe some people who would be listening to this podcast, but gender kind of intentionally separates itself away from sex, both like historically in how it was formulated and in what we mean it to be today. So when we're talking about gender, we're explicitly saying sex is not enough. Sex is not sufficient to allocate people into these different categories. Gender has some role to play here. And that makes some people very upset. Some people think that sex does explain or should explain everything, that there are no insufficiencies. And we see that with like the most obvious and most controversial is the athletics, where it'd say that sex is the one that really truly defines it. That's the most clear-cut place where it comes out. But otherwise, like we see it with abortion. Anti-abortion activists are also part of this trend because they're saying there's this group of people, women, who have this female sex, and that's all there is to it. They should carry these pregnancies to term no matter what, no matter how they feel, no matter how they wish to live their life. Sex is the end of it. Sex defines it.
Yeah, I want to come back to something you said right at the start there, which is that this isn't just an American phenomenon, but we're seeing gender and the question of gender or being against gender as kind of a worldwide movement. One detail I can never get out of my head is that Vladimir Putin, when he's explaining why he invaded Ukraine, he says the West is trying to cancel Russia like they canceled J.K. Rowling. And what was J.K. Rowling canceled for? It was transphobia. And you can see the Russian propaganda tends to make a lot of hay out of gender in the West, and how Russia has traditional good gender norms where men are men and women are women, and in the West they're debauched and perverted and blah blah blah. You can see in South Korea there's been a lot of issues about, again, sex and gender, about people who are uncomfortable with changing norms about sex and gender. So I think, those are just two examples, but I think you're absolutely right to kind of situate this in a much larger worldwide movement, current of thought. I mean, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, to talk about like South Korea, like that's a great example because they have a lot of these liberal institutions and structures and just kind of a society, so to speak. And that promises, regardless of your sex, regardless of your gender, there is some kind of meritocracy going on. You can succeed, you can climb the ranks. That has not necessarily been the case because there's a lot of people who do not believe that women should be climbing the ranks in South Korea. They think you're born a woman and therefore you kind of sit on a lower pedestal. Now, women being born into this supposedly, liberal structure, they're mad about not being actually able to take advantage of this liberal structure. And men are getting mad that women are trying to rise in the ranks, become managers and CEOs. And therefore, they actually have to compete meritocratically as opposed to just getting that because they were born male.
Yeah, I really like this is this is like the line of thinking I have about what is really going on about these issues in general. It's, you hear this advocacy of meritocracy and individualism all the time from conservatives in this country. But I think, that rhetoric is about validating status, right? It's saying I'm where I am and it's because of merit, obviously, because we're in a meritocracy. But when the opportunity comes along to, say, knock a large group of people down in status below oneself and the group one is part of, they so frequently are like, oh, that's great. I'd love to do that, right? Can we knock the gays down? Can we knock, whoever? It's like, oh, wonderful. Here's an opportunity to elevate myself on society's status ladder, a big chunk in one swoop. And they seem to want that opportunity all the time, right? And then, of course, label the results as somehow still meritocracy, of course.
Yeah, I mean, I think this gets into some of my own hobby horses. As a horrible, unreconstructed second wave feminist, but I'm joking here. They had all kinds of problems, the second wavers, but there are certain things that I think they provide real insight about. And in this case, it's this concept of the patriarchal bargain, which is this way of expressing relations between men and women and what men get from women and what women get from men in a patriarchal society, where there's this idea that what men are providing to women is security and prosperity, material stuff, production. And what women are providing to men is children, and also, like Jason's kind of suggesting, women provide the psychic wage of hierarchy. You have a wife at home who's yours, and that she's required to be subordinate to you, and that gives you that little hit of feeling better than somebody else.
Well, actually, you merit
right, and
being elevated above her. You just
well, yeah, we find a way to tell a story.
She's
about
required
how
because of her inferior merit to be below. Are people going to quote this out of context?
Anyways, so yeah, and these kinds of structures are built on exclusion, right? On the idea that women don't really have a lot of choice, right? You can't be a woman alone in the world. You can't provide for yourself because you're systematically excluded from having a job in society, and like it's also a kind of a violent and dangerous society. And the threat of rape, frankly, is always kind of lurking out there in the distance as a way to discipline women into like attaching themselves to men. Right? This is a picture of how the world works. And the thing is that it's breaking down, right? That we are living in a world where increasingly it doesn't really matter how big your biceps are. That we're living in a world that's dominated by technology, by the use of your brain more than your muscles. And this is reflected in economic data, right, that show that productivity per worker has been going up very steadily for the last several hundred years, that, it's becoming increasingly, just economically good for women to work outside the home and earn a wage than it is to provide domestic labor inside the home. The returns to going to work are just been going up and up and up. And this just creates a societal pressure against the patriarchal bargain, because it gives women more options, right? That it's possible to be a woman alone in the world, and you're not required. So, by social pressure, by custom, by whatever kinds of material necessities to get married, as Jane Austen's famous phrase would have it. And so, I mean, I would argue anyways that like this global concern about gender, about trans people kind of reflects the way in which traditional gender relations are just under pressure.
Definitely. And we can see this really clearly with regards to like abortion and birth rates, mostly birth rates. But the reality is, as these different societies have gotten anxious about birth rates falling, they've tried to incentivize it, tried to provide generous child care subsidies and all these different things. And what we found coming out of it is that it doesn't matter that much. Like, childcare subsidies, better wages, for people who are doing home care, it makes those conditions better, but it doesn't actually increase the birth rates from what I've seen. And the reason for that is because you would have to provide quite a lot of money in order to actually match the financial gains that they are giving up by not entering the workforce.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, there's an intuitive story people like to tell here. They say, "Oh, birth rates are falling because it's so expensive to have a child, and so if we just defray the costs of childcare, we can increase birth rates." But a lot of different countries have tried this, so we have some nice empirical data about the effects of different sizes of subsidies for various different kinds of programs. And like you say, at any kind of politically feasible level of subsidy, the effect seems to be no. Arguably, like you say, that's because the amount of money you'd have to pay somebody to match the opportunity cost of not going into the workforce would be enormous. And that's probably not going to happen. There's also the argument to be made that it's not even necessarily about the money, but about what you're giving up on the level of being treated as a free and equal citizen. I mean, again, South Korea might be a good example here, where it seems what South Korean men want from their wives is a level of control, right? A level of subservience, a level of you don't get to make your own decisions about your life anymore, that people don't want to give up, right? That people like, given the choice, people like being free and equal citizens if they have that option.
No, that's definitely the case. That patriarchal bargain just does not make any sense in our current society, with what's available to most people. And like we had talked about, like that makes some people very mad. They want these women to fall into their place of being wives, providing free home care, having children, propagating their families, and men just be on top one way or another. That doesn't make any
Yeah.
sense in a free and equal society.
Yeah, I think it's interesting also because you see on the right anyways, there are these fantasies out there of like we are gonna wind the clock backwards. We are gonna put women back into the kitchen. This is Gilead from Margaret Atwood's novel, where we're going to go back, we're going to systematically exclude women from participation in public life, and afterwards they won't have a choice. They'll have to go back to the patriarchal bargain. I don't think this is going to happen for basically the same reason that you were talking about in terms of opportunity cost. Whether you pay it as a direct subsidy or, you keep it off the balance books, but you are systematically excluding people from the workforce, that's an enormous, enormous economic penalty that your country would have to pay to achieve those ends. And these kinds of authoritarians, I think, would struggle to implement that just because they are so they're all also often quite obsessed with national greatness, national power, national industry, and taking women out of the workforce en masse would be enormously damaging to any modern country's economy. So I think the possibilities of just going back the way the right fantasizes about are enormously difficult to implement. But at the same time, it raises these questions. Well, what do we do instead? Right? What do we replace the patriarchal bargain with?
I'm not entirely sure anyone's entirely figured that one out yet. There's certainly, I've seen people argue that we will just simply have to radically restructure society. And these aren't radicals who I've seen saying this, but just pointing out, Social Security relies on a lot of young people entering the workforce in order to kind of really make it flow. Having a very top heavy age pyramid might throw a wrench into that plan. And so we would need to rework our economies, rework our welfare plans in order to make this a sustainable society, because there is a kernel of truth, just a kernel of truth in what these anti-gender people are saying. There are problems that are coming down the line or are already here. There are concerns to be had. We're not quite at a stable configuration yet.
No, I think that's exactly right. It's something that I do find a little bit frustrating about this topic is that it is the question of birth rates and what they mean. It's really mostly you find, white nationalists and eugenicists who are most obsessed with these questions. And so it can create kind of a suggestion that even by talking about them, you're endorsing their framing. But you're right that there are real problems to societies that have extremely low birth rates, just in purely material terms. Again, South Korea is unfortunately, we're going to come back to this one a bunch because it's a good example of one of the worst case outcomes here, where South Korea has a birth rate of something like 1 per woman, which is very low, which is a society that is going to be halving in size every generation. And that is, like you say, it's going to create a society that is at a population pyramid that is extremely top heavy, that has an enormous number of retirees relative to current workers, and will continue to do so for the foreseeable future. And this is going to create, in important ways, substantially less economic growth, substantially less prosperity for everybody involved. And you can see it in some ways that this is the fear, anyways, is that this is going to create a kind of a self-reinforcing spiral, as we're already seeing in South Korea, right? Where men are unhappy about the situation that they're in, and they become more misogynistic as a result. And women are more like, yeah, I don't want to get married to you and have children if this is the kind of man I'm going to have to marry. And so you have this kind of social economic problem that seems at least like a bad equilibrium to be in. America is not there yet. Most Americans still want to and do have children. We still have a very high and successful rate of immigration. So the problem for us is not quite so bad yet, but for other countries around the world, it can be a real problem.
For many decades, the world population has spiked rapidly upward, and this was, of course, proposed to be a problem requiring all sorts of answers, possibly to some extent. And the specter of a plunging world population certainly hasn't arrived yet. Not totally clear how severe the problems would be, but it's the richest, most productive world in history right now, and that should mean that this world is better equipped to tackle problems such as that. Problems such as people needing healthcare. You talked about subsidies, Samantha, and the idea of somehow trying to incentivize births through subsidies, you could as easily subsidize elder care, probably do a better job addressing that problem indirectly. You by so doing, you probably would remove some. You might have a positive effect on the birth rate by doing that as well. The world has a lot of problems. It always has a lot of problems. We have a massive problem with climate change. So, I would sort of put the specter of at some point, will the world's population start to decline? I would say, well, it kind of goes on the pile of our big problems. And it's not clear how severe of a policy would you want to impose right now to deal with it. We have an obvious climate crisis. I'm living down here in Texas, and I can tell you it's very, very real. I'm not quite sure in the northern states they feel it quite the way we do here. And it's not clear that we are doing what it takes to address that crisis. And I would kind of suggest, like, if you're going to put on some policies and allocate some funding to address big world problems, I'm personally going to rank that one above the idea that, well, at some point the world population growth rate might turn negative. I'm going to put that way on the back burner in terms of what we need to deal with.
No, I don't disagree with that at all. Especially, like I said, in the United States, this does not seem like a serious problem. You can make arguments about South Korea, you can various other kinds of countries that are, so to speak, in a different situation than the United States. I bring it up primarily as an illustration of the gender question, right? Why is that, like, this is what you might call like a symptom of the crisis in gender, the sense like that the old paradigm has broken down, but that we haven't replaced it with something, it's broken down in a material way, but it endures in the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves, right? About what it means to be a good man, to be a protector and a provider. Those are very common stories, right? We still tell stories about, the knight rescuing the princess from the orc, right? That's a story about gender. That's a story about men and women and what they do for each other. What it means to be a good man, namely a knight, and what it means to be a bad man, namely an orc. And I don't think we've really thoroughly, comprehensively answered the question about what comes next in a way that satisfies people. And I think, just to kind of bring this back to the abortion question, that you can see the abortion question is like the trans question, one that's continuing to rack our politics here in America. You can see it in the very high gender polarization of the electorate, where Harris outran Trump by about 10 points with women. That gender polarization is even higher among young women, something like 12 points, which is quite striking.
The solution is clear. We must take the vote away from men.
I was thinking that actually, if we had like a girlification ray, and we could just use that on like 10 or 12% of the population, it would solve a lot of problems.
LGBT people voted for Harris at like Assad numbers. So, that would probably, the transification rate would probably really shift the needle here. Our answer to the anti-trans ads.
Yeah, if you among our listeners are a mad scientist who has a transgenderification ray, then please let us know. We will work on mass deployment momentarily.
The proposals we've made in the last minute are exactly the proposals that the Democratic Party has long been accused of wanting to put forward. So, we are right. We're doing exactly what we're supposed to be doing here at Neon Liberalism.
And I think that points to exactly the accusation that congressional Democrats keep trying to pull out, and it just hasn't landed yet. It'd be great if we could figure out a way to get it to land, but that Republicans and conservatives in general don't have a great answer to this crisis in gender. This go back answer is not particularly possible. Everyone likes the idea of going back until you tell them, oh yeah, abortion is going to be illegal. And then we find that people are like, actually, we like having access to abortion. There's not a clear answer. And so they make up crazy things that the other side wants to do. So it's like, oh, well, we obviously have the sane answer because we already tried that and it was working great back then. Just brush away all the problems underneath the rug here, forget about those.
Yeah, I
Right.
mean, and
And
certainly like this is like you say, is just one of the core issues with the trans debates. Is like, well, what are Republicans actually proposing, right? When they propose to ban trans people from bathrooms, are they saying there should be a cop at every bathroom stall looking up every woman's skirt before she's allowed to use the bathroom? Right? Are they proposing that individual people, if they see someone in the bathroom and they think she doesn't look feminine enough, they're allowed to attack that person? Because that's happened. That's happened to a number of cis women in places where bathroom bills have been proposed or enacted. Right, the level of enforcement and monitoring of people and their genitals and their biology is a level of intrusion onto individual life that is difficult to deal with.
I mean, presumably it in practice would be a completely complaint-driven policy, but what happens after a complaint is lodged? And it just obviously just seems to descend into just awful places.
Yeah, unfortunately, it seems like conservatives do kind of have an answer for that one with the I believe it was a Texas SB 8, $10,000 reward for if you can find someone who did an abortion. There's an anti-abortion group in Texas I read just the other day. They were holding off until after the election, but they are now going out looking for men whose partners had abortions so that they could sort of stand behind those men, sue the partners, get $10,000. Now, that's an incredible level of control, punitive control. It reinforces men being on top, and it, what's the word here, outsources away from the government. So the government doesn't really have to do the enforcing all that much. They just do the arbitration in civil court. It's really individual groups and actors that are doing it. This is an awful solution, but that does seem to be what they're heading for.
Yeah, when you put it that way, it does, it seems quite plausible. And I mean, after all, the patriarchy was always mostly enforced by individual action, not by the state and its gender enforcers, but by just individual people who were supported by society and by the state and what they did and the various kinds of violence they pursued.
Yeah, it's
So,
it's like a
yeah,
policy of if this makes you mad, then we'll stand behind you. You know what I mean? As
Yeah.
opposed to, I don't know, the opposite. Where people's imagination goes is, oh, they're going to issue bathroom permits to everybody and scan them at the back. They're not going to do that. It's going to be what you said, Sophia. It's going to be this sort of like empowering, defending whoever is mad enough.
yeah, it's a dysfunctional vision of government right there, but it's how we run a lot of things. So,
It's a very American solution, we'll say that. The incredible amounts of federalism that we have, ups and downs. I'm not sure how well that's going to play in other countries, but America likes to export its culture. So we're going to find out probably in the next few years.
yeah, yeah, we certainly are. I guess I want to ask a question that I don't really know the answer to here, because we've been a little bit gloomy about the Republican Party and what they're pursuing. As the saying goes, abortion was on the ballot this past election, not just in the person of Kamala Harris, but in a number of referenda about whether abortion should be banned in various states, and the abortion initiatives did pretty well. I mean, for the pro-choice side, right? That even in very deep red states that Trump won, voters declined to ban abortion. Do you have an idea of what's up with that?
It seems like, from what I've seen, what I've read from voters, they don't really believe that Republicans, generally speaking, actually are anti-abortion in that way, in like a very deep way, which is a questionable thing to believe, but we can't count on voters to have high levels of knowledge on it, all the workings of politics. So I would not really blame voters entirely for that one. It's really just like they don't want to give up their freedom. They like the idea of solving these different issues of gender. They like stabilizing out sex so they don't really have to deal with all this transgender nonsense, but they don't want to give up their freedoms at the same time.
Voters just elected the president who, is going to implement the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025, which those same voters said they absolutely hated. So what can you make of such a situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think this gets back to some of the things we were talking about last week in terms of the gap between what the median voter seems to believe about America and the parties and what's true about America and about the parties. The Republican Party, I mean, for most of our life, they've not been quiet about abortion, about the idea that abortion is murder, that they're against Roe versus Wade, they want to repeal Roe versus Wade, they want to ban abortion. They're and yeah, like you say, a lot of people went to the polls thinking, well, they don't really mean it. Trump doesn't really mean it. He's not really going to do it. Um,
Or maybe they think he can't. Maybe they believe in the power of the deep state. Um,
Power of the deep state. If only we
maybe they
had
maybe
some
they
deep
just think
state
Trump will
gender police.
maybe they think Trump will put a dent in things, he'll shake things up, but like the stuff they really don't like, he won't be able to do. I mean, they can tell themselves that. It could be true. It
Yeah,
could be
I
true.
mean, again, I think this takes us back to some of our questions from last week. There are going to be people out there who are already saying, well, Trump wins, and that proves that people liked Trump's policies, right? But that seems to come into contrast with the fact that, you know, people don't like Project 2025 if you explain it to them. They do want abortion to be legal to some extent, when given the choice. Uh, so it suggests that, like you say, Trump's appeal was a lot about shaking things up, about fixing what's wrong with America, whatever you imagine that to be, rather than necessarily the specifics of the conservative platform that he and his group have endorsed.
I will say there's one potentially interesting exception here. That's in the religious evangelical bloc. When you kind of break it down, look at the nitty gritty, the group that Trump really, really gained with, the group of women that Trump really gained with was evangelical and born again women, made huge margins, like double digit gains in terms of percentage point margins. And those are, in fact, the people who would believe that the Republican Party is anti-abortion. So it does seem like there's a little bit of a two-pronged issue here. A lot of the people who actually believe that he's going to restrict abortion like that, and a lot of the people who don't believe that he's going to restrict abortion also like that. They kind of, this trend we've seen with Trump is people just kind of believe whatever they want about him.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right, that there is some deeper questions here. It does not seem like an election where people are voting like rational policy prefers, where they looked at the candidates, said they looked at the menu of policies in a clear way and said, I want that one. Um, but an election that was much more about narrative. And like you say, a narrative that could run in both directions depending on what you wanted to hear. What exactly to do about that, I don't have an answer, but it seems at least an interesting data point.
I'm thinking back to Neon Liberalism episode number 1, where we explored 4 possible explanations for the election results, and I proposed that 4th, which was there's a substantial number, apparently, of evangelical Christians who believe that Donald Trump is a Christian prophet. And certainly, if that is your foundational view of things, you are going to be inclined to think that what he is for is good, and that he has a secret plan or an overt plan or really whatever, but you're just sort of fundamentally committed to the idea that Donald Trump is good, right? And so, boy, tough one to tackle there, but to the extent that this Donald Trump is literally a Christian prophet movement has picked up steam, could have something to do with that shift among evangelical Christians in the data that you're mentioning.
Yeah, unfortunately, evangelical Christians have a lot of sway on politics, even now as they begin to drop, even now as they are less clearly Christian. It's been a consistent trend over time with them that they hold less and less to traditional theological orthodoxy, but they are more and more holding that Trump is a prophet chosen by God. He avoided that assassination attempt because God did it. God saved him. And they are organized. They organized back with Reagan, and they're still very organized. And they do not like abortion. They do not like gender.
Yeah, I mean, I think this comes to, I mean, this just to bring it back to something I was talking about earlier in terms of the stories we tell ourselves about gender and men and women. Often people have raised this question of like, well, how could evangelicals possibly support Trump? He doesn't embody any of the traditional Christian virtues. But there's a story you can tell where he embodies, some of the traditional masculine virtues, right? He's rich, he's powerful, he has a lot of kids. He has a bunch of kids, he's had a bunch of wives, much like the biblical patriarchs were always getting up to.
I was going to say he's
Um,
an Old Testament Christian.
yeah, I think
I'm
there's
glad
something
Sophia
to
laughed at
that.
that. That was pretty funny.
Yeah, I mean, no, there's something to that though, that he's embodying these kind of, you could say ancient or you could say atavistic, conceptions of what a big man is. And that people, it scratches some itch deep in their gender brain to think, oh yeah, who do we want in charge? It's a big man, rather than Harris, who in many ways, is a very modern woman, right? She doesn't have any, she is not born any children. She married another man, she's raising his children with him, right? She has her own self-standing career. She didn't, come onto the scene as somebody else's wife or the daughter, or, right? She's, like I said, self-standing, but not attached to a man. And this embodies a very modern kind of woman, modern possibilities for how to be a woman in the world. Um, and so that's, I mean, certainly an argument that I don't think, the general punditry has wanted to touch, that this was an election that was driven by misogyny, or, to put it a different way, by the stories people still tell themselves about what makes for a good man and a good woman, and how that fits or doesn't fit with the world we find ourselves in.
I'm going to reiterate an idea I've put forward a couple times to fit into what you just said here. Democrats should run big man who's a woman. They should run a butch lesbian who's like very tall, very buff, lots of ads with her like chopping down trees and grilling steaks. I think that would be like a 50-state sweep right there.
Yeah, I mean, I personally would love to see it, so no argument from me.
Yeah, Samantha, I really like what you say about old stories and a world where certain things that may have once been more important are decidedly less important. If they were once important, they're clearly less important now, right? But we have these stories about men related to physical strength, and you can, without squinting too hard, just see a lot of what is going on as like intense efforts by some to reaffirm these older stories, right? The stories people have been telling themselves about the Russia-Ukraine war, and what a military is supposed to be, right?
Oh yeah,
Or
it's great when
and
you see, these propaganda ads from Russia or North Korea that show really buff, shirtless men jumping into icy water, and some Republican commentator will say, and that's what America's military can't do anymore. We don't have enough buff dudes who can break boards with their foreheads.
yeah, and you also see, you see also like generally on the right these intense efforts to try to appeal. You said that the world is less driven by muscle, more driven by intelligence. Not sure how much it's ever necessary. I mean, intelligence has always probably been extremely important, but you just see these intense efforts to try to affirm these just ridiculous ideas that intelligence is supposedly correlated with other things, which, I just think that experience just should tell you is just plainly not true. But that's something that people used to believe in very strongly. And so you can kind of see that whole movement as, again, like just an attempt to reaffirm these old stories that you would have hoped that we'd know better by now. But, people don't seem to want to know better.
No, I think that's exactly right. That I do think it's true that you can that patriarchy had something like a material basis. There's reasons that it lasted for such a long time, that it was so widespread, that it's so ancient, that it has some material basis, but that material basis is breaking down, right? And that it's breaking down in a way that no one has ever been able to stop or even really wanted to stop because it is so closely tied with the modern world, with the progress of technology and productivity. And people like the stuff. You can do so much stuff with the stuff. And no one really wants to wind that clock backwards. But the story endures even after the material basis has started to crumble. And so we get these situations where people, they can't roll back the tide, but they're trying really hard. And, they're flailing around there. And we're all kind of the worse for it. But at the same time, I don't have an answer exactly as to what comes next.
Well, Samantha, Sophia, thank you for
Yeah.
being on. Read Sophia Hottel's article at liberalcurrents.com, our fine hosts. That's a wrap on neon. I almost said neoliberalism, which is the thing where we were so worried people would misread the title, and now I slip and say it. Anyway,
Yeah,
neon
we're
liberalism
definitely
number 2.
neon liberalism.
Yeah, neon
Yes.
liberals. That's right. That's who we are potentially,
So
maybe.
join us next week as we continue our journey into figuring out the shape of the future, or something like that.
Indeed.